Okay, so ready to dive into something that's honestly way more interesting than it sounds.
I'd say so.
School budgeting.
Yeah.
Now, I know what you're thinking, spreadsheets, numbers. Ugh, not my thing.
Right.
But trust me on this one. We're not just talking about crunching numbers here. This is about how those numbers, like, directly affect our kids and their education, you know?
It's true. A school budget, you can almost think of it like a recipe
Okay.
for a successful learning environment. The ingredients are the resources, right? And that final dish, that's the quality of education.
Makes sense. So today we're using HPGD2203 Topic 4 Budgeting.pdf. We're going to use excerpts from that to really break down how this whole process works. Yeah. And just to give you a little teaser here, did you know that you can actually see how your tax dollars are being spent at your kid's school? Yep. School budgets, they're public documents, and don't worry, we'll tell you exactly how to find them later in the show.
Yeah.
But first, let's get back to that whole recipe idea.
So just like with any recipe, you need a plan. You need to execute that plan, and then obviously you need to evaluate how it all turned out. And well, that's basically what this source material lays out for us. 3 major components of a school budget: planning, acting, and then evaluating.
Right.
Sounds simple enough, right?
Yeah.
But just like with any recipe, there are layers to each of those components.
Absolutely.
And they directly impact everything. I mean, we're talking everything from hiring teachers to even just like buying basic classroom supplies.
So it's definitely not just about like dividing up a pile of money at the beginning of the year and just hoping for the best.
Right, exactly.
And speaking of all those layers, our source actually dives into five key functions of budgeting: planning, acting, evaluating, and then controlling and communicating. And it even gets like really specific and breaks these things down. For example, talks about something called records of the past.
Oh, yeah.
Which is essentially just using, past spending to try to make better decisions for the future. Then there's predictions of future actions, which I feel like is pretty self-explanatory, right?
Exactly.
You're trying to predict what you're going to need.
And those predictions are really what help schools allocate their resources effectively. And then the communication piece of it all, that ensures that everyone's on the same page,
Right.
about where the money's going and why.
Transparency is key. Now, before we move on, I'm curious, have you ever wondered how different schools even approach this whole budgeting thing?
Oh, yeah?
Because it turns out it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of deal.
No.
It's not, right?
I thought.
There are a bunch of different approaches that schools can take, and our trusty source, HPGD2203 Topic 4 Budgeting.pdf, lays them all out for us.
It does.
It's kind of like choosing your own financial adventure, but for your school.
Ooh, I like that. Choosing your own adventure. And yeah, just like with any good adventure, there are different paths that you can take. So let's start with one that this source calls site-based budgeting.
Okay, so site-based budgeting, what is that?
So imagine a school where the principal and the teachers actually have more of a say in how the money is spent.
Okay.
That's basically what this is.
Got it.
It's all about, giving those who are closest to the students, the people who see the needs firsthand every single day, it gives them more control over that budget.
So kind of like school-level democracy in action.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be really empowering, especially for teachers who have really innovative ideas for their classrooms. But what about schools that maybe need a more simplified approach? Is there something for them?
Yeah, there's definitely an option for that. It's called limited plan budgeting. And this approach basically just streamlines things. They focus on those essential spending categories. So it's less about, trying to reinvent the wheel and more about just making sure that all of the basics are covered.
Practical. To the point. I like it. Now, our source material also mentions something called zero-based budgeting, which, honestly, that sounds kind of intense.
It can be. It can be. Zero-based budgeting basically means that you are starting from scratch every single year.
Wow.
Every single dollar has to be justified based on the current needs and the goals of that school year.
Wow. Talk about a clean slate.
Yes.
A financial fresh start.
Okay.
Okay, so what else is on the menu here? What other budgeting adventures can we go on?
Well, let's say that your school is really all about aligning their spending with, very specific goals.
Okay.
Let's say that they're really trying to improve literacy rates or maybe boost STEM education.
Yeah.
Then program budgeting might be the way to go.
Okay.
Because it's all about connecting those financial resources directly to, those desired outcomes for students.
So measurable goals, measurable results. I like it. And then we have pragmatic budgeting, which I'm guessing is exactly what it sounds like.
It really is. It's all about building on the previous year's budget. So you're basically making adjustments based on what worked well, what maybe needs a little bit of tweaking,
Yeah.
So it's kind of a more evolutionary approach to budgeting.
We're taking what you learned
Yeah.
and, adapting.
Yeah.
And last but not least, we have incremental budgeting.
Right. So this one involves making small adjustments to the previous year's budget. And while it might seem like, the easiest route at first glance, it can actually lead to, maybe some missed opportunities if you're not really carefully evaluating those incremental changes each year.
So it's kind of like each of these approaches has its own pros and cons, right?
Yeah.
Just like any good adventure path. But no matter which path the school chooses, the journey doesn't stop there. There's this whole other element, this whole cycle to this whole budgeting thing, a whole cycle. Tell me more about this.
Right. So choosing your budgeting approach, that's really just the first step.
Right.
From there, we get into this whole budget cycle.
Okay.
It's a multi-step process that really takes you from those initial plans to actually, putting the money into action in the school.
Got it.
And lucky for us, our source, HPGD2203 Topic 4 Budgeting.pdf, breaks this cycle down into 5 key stages. And it all starts with the development of budget guidelines.
Okay, so this is where the school district kind of lays down the law, right? Don't say this is how the money can be spent.
Exactly. It's like setting the boundaries, right? So they're outlining their priorities. They might say, okay, this year we're really focusing on improving technology access, or, you know what, we really need to invest more in teacher training. It's really about setting that overall financial direction for the entire year.
Got it. So once those guidelines are kind of, set in stone, what happens next?
Right. So then we move on to stage 2, which is the preparation of documents. This is where, the rubber meets the road. This is where schools and different departments in the school, they have to figure out how much everything is actually going to cost.
Yeah.
From new textbooks to maybe even building repairs, they've got to get down to the nitty-gritty. And so they put together these budget requests and, everyone's hoping that they're going to get the funding they need.
I can only imagine the spreadsheets.
Oh, absolutely. There's tons of number crunching going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets even more interesting. Stage 3, modifications to the original budget.
Ooh. So it's not always a smooth ride.
Not always. Sometimes those initial requests, they need to be adjusted. Maybe the district doesn't have as much funding as everyone had hoped, or maybe priorities have shifted a little bit since those first drafts. So there's often this back and forth, a little bit of negotiation before that final budget actually gets the green light.
It's a balancing act. Okay, yeah. So who gives that final stamp of approval after, all the modifications have been made and everything?
All right, so that's where step 4 comes in, obtaining approval.
Okay.
And typically, it's the school board that has the final say. So they'll review that budget, they make sure that it aligns with the district's overall goals, and then, if all goes well, they give it their blessing.
Talk about pressure. I would not want to be the one presenting that budget to the school board.
It's definitely a big responsibility, but remember, this whole process, it's really about transparency and accountability.
Right.
It's about making sure that the community actually has a say in how their tax dollars are being used for education.
Makes sense. And then finally, the moment of truth.
Right. Managing the budget.
Let's do it.
So the budget, it's no longer just some plan on paper, right?
Yeah, right.
Now it's time to actually put it into action. This involves keeping a close eye on all of the spending that's happening, making those necessary adjustments throughout the year if you need to, and most importantly, just making sure that that money is actually being used effectively to reach those goals we were talking about earlier.
So you're kind of like this financial air traffic controller.
Exactly.
Making sure everything runs smoothly.
Yeah, I got to keep everything on course.
It's not just about, coloring inside the lines, right? Yeah. There's also this element of evaluation.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not enough to just spend the money. We need to know if it's actually making a real difference, right?
Right.
So evaluation helps us to answer those really critical questions. Did we actually achieve what we set out to do? Were the resources used wisely? And what can we learn from this year's budget to make next year even better?
Continuous improvement. I like it. So we've explored the ins and outs of school budgeting, from those initial planning stages all the way to actually putting that budget into action and, of course, evaluating its impact.
And I think we learned that it's a pretty complex process, a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it all comes down to one thing: making sure that schools have the resources they need to provide that high-quality education for every student.
That's a mission we can all get behind. Now, before we sign off, remember how we mentioned that school budgets are actually public documents? That means you have the power to see how your tax dollars are being spent. We'll be sure to include links in our show notes so you can access those documents for your local school district.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to ask questions, get involved, make your voice heard.
Informed citizens make for stronger schools. That's it for our deep dive into the world of school budgeting. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit empowering. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those questions coming.